All right. Okay. So we're on again. All right. All right, Frank. Let me invite you. We're gonna we're gonna keep rocking it until we get that in. It's gonna happen. Yes, it's gonna happen. Yes. Glory to the Most High, man. Ah, sorry, I don't know what's up with IG, man. IG sometimes it's a bit finicky at times, man. How are you doing, sir?
Fine, fine. Thank you. Thanks for having me, and glad to see that everything is working well finally. Yeah.
Man, it's rad to be like seriously to have you and thanks for wanting to even come on here. Really appreciate it, man.
Oh, it's
Um
a pleasure. It's an honor, and thanks for inviting me. Actually, I was quite surprised when you first sent the invitation on Instagram a few weeks ago. I was kind of surprised and kind of honored. To be honest with you, it's
well
been a
shoot,
long, long
man.
time.
I don't even
Trying
know
to.
what to say. Like seriously, like you've done a lot of work yourself, man. And I feel like even with what I know about you, I feel like I'm just scratching the surface. You mind if I introduce you?
No, no, no. Of course, please, please go ahead, please, please.
All right, you guys. It's hard for me sometimes to not do a long introduction, so I'm gonna try to be brief, but if I'm not, please forgive me. Frank BIYONG is a composer, musician. He's worked with the likes of people like Tony Allen of Fela Kuti's band, um, King Sunny ID, um, Salif Keita, and so many different cats that like. There's a lot. He's performed and worked with a lot of different people, and he pioneered a style called Afroelectric, which is a fusion of Afrobeat, electro funk, and avant-garde jazz. And I'm gonna also say rock and roll too. Um, and he has a long list of just different things that he's been involved in. And we're gonna talk about the long list instead of me just like saying it. And I really appreciate this brother all the way. He's based in France, right?
Yeah, no, I'm most of the times I'm based in back home in Yaoundé because my mother is based there, and most of the work is done in Nairobi in Kenya because in East Africa I worked on a TV show years ago, and I really managed to get some deep connection with musicians there, and the musical scene there is very diverse and very creative. So, and when I have to finalize projects or do the final business, I would say, touches on projects and stuff, I have to travel to France because, as you know, Francophone Africa is very much still linked with France when it comes to music business and, contracts and stuff like that, and, copywriting or even, registering in your songs for, music rights and stuff like that. So yeah, so the final touches are in France, and now I'm based in Paris because I'm working on a new project. Basically, I'm here just to work on a new project. So yeah, and I hope it's going to be done around February, so I can go back home and then back to Nairobi again.
That's
Yeah.
so cool. Now I have to ask this because we interviewed last year my friend Ingrid. I always mess up her name. I don't want to mess up her name, but she does a festival called Rafiki.
Oh
She's very. Are you
yeah,
familiar with that?
yeah. I know that festival. I never performed there, but I know that festival. Yeah, Rafiki. That's in Kenya, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
we
Great.
interviewed. I don't want to mess up her last name, but Ingrid. I'm gonna have to give you her info if you don't know it already. She's really cool. We interviewed her last year, talking about that whole movement and just what she's been doing with that. So it's so cool to. That's another thing I like making connections if cats ain't connected. So that's what I
Yeah.
like to do. And it's cool that you pretty much international, if anything. I mean, you've performed in America. You performed at the Montreal Jazz Festival. you're based in France, and you have roots also, from what I've read, in Gabon, Nigeria, and you're Cameroonian, right?
Yeah, I mean, both my parents are Cameroonian, and the thing that happened is that around that time, I was born in the early 1970s, and around that time, the situation, political and economic situation in Africa was kind of different. And my parents were teachers, and because Cameroon has that particular position in Francophone Africa, because we were originally a German colony, and then after the First World War, we became a French and British protectorate. So, which means that a few Cameroonians are actually Anglophones, those who are located on not far from the border of Nigeria. So both my parents were teachers. And so in the early 1970s, the economic development in Africa was a bit better. Actually, this was like 10, 15 years after the independences. And so they had the opportunity to travel to a few countries to actually teach, mostly English. So that's how we went to Gabon in 1977. Then we actually went to Nigeria. And then we stayed in Ivory Coast for like 7 or 8 years, because at the time, Ivory Coast was considered to be the African economic miracle, quote unquote. The level of economic development around that time in Ivory Coast was similar to South Korea, in the 1980s.
Wow.
And then after the devaluation in 1994, everything, came to a halt, and the economy is starting crashing down one by one. But around that time, in the early 1970s and in 1980s to a certain extent, the situation in Africa was a bit, I wouldn't say better, but there was more emphasis on culture and on education. That's how my parents managed to actually travel in various countries. And we were very fortunate as Cameroonians to be able to live abroad and see different African cultures from the gate jump. And also Ivory Coast was a very important cultural hub in Africa around that time. Manu Dibango, for example, after the Soul Makossa success in America, he went to Ivory Coast in 1975.
Wow.
That's, yeah, because the president, Ufot Boigny, around that time was investing a lot of money in arts and culture, and education. So that's why we spent so much time in Ivory Coast around that time. Yeah.
So I have to ask this. This is going to tie into the next question that I have. I have a bunch of questions, obviously, but how did this affect you even as a musician, and when did that start? And you moving around different parts of Africa, everybody thinks of African music as just a one monolith thing, and it's not. There's so many different diverse things, like too much. Not just through countries, but also through tribes and even ethnics within that tribe, or just different places. So how did this affect, and when did you start playing too, and what instrument?
I was very fortunate, again, because my father really loved music. He wasn't a musician, but he played a little bit of guitar. He played a little bit of keyboards as well. And my family in Cameroon comes from the church, the Protestant church, because of the German influence. So my father was singing as a choir boy when he was young. So my father used to listen to a lot of music when we were young. And, around that time, people had stereos, people had vinyls, because, music was some kind of a, information in a way, the same way we use the internet today. People would use, vinyl records and music in general to communicate and to pass messages. So the music at home was very influential, first of all. Then my father was playing a little bit. And when we went to Ivory Coast, all of us went to the National Institute of Arts in Ivory Coast to take music lessons. That's the piano. My elder brother and my younger sister were taking piano lessons. And I wasn't very good at piano, but the musical education, the fact that, we were actually involved in a musical environment, in that place, in that school, and at home, was very formative in the beginning. And the first instrument I was very, very interested in was the drums. I started playing drums a little bit earlier, just, banging on, percussion and stuff like that, just like the children do. But the drums came a bit later when I was a teenager. And that's the first instrument I was really interested in. I wanted my father, he bought me a small snare drum, and I was practicing on it over records. Again, once we actually traveled, out of Africa, then to Europe, as you know, because when we went to Europe, that was around in 1986, 1987, around that time, when my father and my mother, they had the opportunity to go and, work in Europe. So that's how we went, again, as teachers. But the first instrument was the drums. The bass came a bit later, and finally was the guitar. My elder brother was also playing music. He was also writing songs, playing the guitar quite well. And that was also very influential, having another brother, someone, who also is very passionate and interested in music, for you to be actually also drawn into music. So yeah, I would say started with the drums, then the bass, then the guitar. Yeah, the guitar around when I was 16, 17, around that time. But took a very, very, very long time before I eventually even managed to get that decent sound out of the instrument. Because, music has always been something very that I respected a lot. The music that I heard that inspired me always made me reflect about the fact that there was something spiritual out of it. So, and also I understood quite early on that I would have to put a lot of time and investment and effort into it in order to be able to produce anything of value in a certain way. My brother was very talented. He was writing songs, singing fluently. He was like having a great voice, and I was admiring him a lot. And he was it was a motivation for me as a youngster to look up to him and try to catch up, in a certain way. Yeah.
Did you and your brother ever form any bands or anything like that? And your sister too?
My younger brother and my younger sister, they weren't performing in bands per se. Me and my older brother, yeah, we used to perform in bands when we were teenagers, and after when we went to university in France, because we around that time, as you know, most of the young people, when they graduate from high school in Africa, some can actually go to university in Africa, and those who have quote unquote more potential have the opportunity to go and study in Europe. Around that time, that's how it was around that time. That was like the early 1990s. So yeah, we used to perform a lot in bands. I was actually playing guitar. My brother was singing, playing the piano, and we were playing all the time, basically. And that was also something that was taken away a bit from the fact that we were supposed to go to college and work, but music was already taking so much space in our lives, and that was a very rich and creative time for music in general, also. So I now, as I reflect, as I'm getting older, I'm realizing that I was very fortunate to grow up around that time, even though people might reflect as the 1980s or 1990s are a difficult period, and it was, on a lot of social and political aspects. But as far as creativity was concerned, I mean, I grew up as a teenager and Michael Jackson was alive and Prince was alive. I mean, it was like, how can you not be inspired by it? I mean, you might never reach that level, but at least it's an inspiration of children all around the world. And for us, especially when we were in Africa, it was like tremendous, to an extent that people might not even imagine. But when Michael Jackson videos were released and we were in Africa, I was on national TV, before the news around the day was like, okay, so the new Michael Jackson video is going to be released, and the country was stopped and everybody was glued to the TVs just waiting for it. So that's how influential and how inspirational that music and that culture, African American, I mean, not African people all around, I would say, but yeah, I think at the south of the Sahara border, I would say the entire continental Africa was inspired by Black American culture to a
I
certain extent.
appreciate that, especially me being a Black American. It's an honor to hear that, and even because I grew up around that time, just remember like seeing like Michael on the video, and everything that he did, like, people were anticipating like, what is the next move? And when he did it, it's like everyone, it's just like we had to we had to be there. Even if we weren't there in person, the fact that there was somebody covering it, he was just such a phenomenal artist. And talk about an eclectic person, which we're going to talk about your eclecticism. Michael definitely was that. When I think of him, people will talk about him in a pop term, but even with that pop music, he incorporated so many different elements from like, soul to even heavy metal type stuff. People don't realize that,
the first guitar that I heard that like blew my ears off was the, Beat It solo, or the Dirty Diana riffs, and even on Off the Wall, there's some guitar there that is not rock per se, but it's like definitely in that tradition. And Prince was even more into rock, the first time I saw Prince again was in Ivory Coast, and that was Purple Rain, you know, and it was scary to us because we had never seen anything like that or heard anything like that. But even my father, remember when the guitar solo was played, he was just turning up the volume on the television and just listening to it, and we were all like looking at this like mesmerized totally. So that's the guitar took so much time because to me the six strings, the frets and everything, just working that thing around didn't make any sense to me. Much later on, I was brave enough to actually finally, you know, get it into my hands and try to do something out of it, try to do something with it. But yeah, the Black American culture in general, you know, was many African musicians or African people would not admit this. But when I'm talking about my father's record collection when we were youngsters, you had the Commodores, you had the Jacksons, you had the, you know, the OJs. In my father's record collection, Louis Armstrong, The Good Book, a lot of jazz, you know, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Sonny Rollins. In my father's record collection, I didn't have to go outside and look for it. It was just there. And we were just looking at the vinyls for hours and just, you know, glancing over it and looking at America like it was on planet Mars or something. That's how it was. That's how it was. That's how we grew up, basically.
That's so cool, man. And especially it's cool because it's just like someone from outside of America and looking at just, you know, the works and being inspired by like a lot of the things that we innovated because, you know, like I know it here and I'm thankful for it, but it's always cool to hear what other cats are thinking and how it inspired them, you know, like and to me, like even thinking about like it's funny you brought up Prince, my homeboy Dewan from last night, because that was a huge influence on him getting into the guitar too, and he talked about it. He's mostly known for like a lot of experimental and death metal type stuff, but he said Prince was like his like one that made him like want to get on the guitar. So it's interesting to hear even his, I mean, hear a Black American and then hear, you know, an African like from you know around the same time, like seriously, and Purple Rain, like, you know, say the same thing. It's just really cool, man. Rest in peace to him and Prince and Michael Jackson, you know, memory eternal. So I have to ask this.
Yes.
With the guitar, was your brother and Prince the I mean, was your brother, I know you mentioned Prince and your brother, but were there other guitarists that kind of helped cultivate that? And it was just like, hey, I gotta play this instrument versus all the other instruments that you play.
Yeah.
Like, what made you really want to stay on the guitar?
When we went to Europe, then that was like complete culture shock. And so, again, that was the mid 1980s. So MTV was there. That was in France. They had a very, very famous TV show in France around that time that was called Children of Rock, Les Enfants du Rock. Children of Rock, that was the name of the show. And so they used to, you know, like broadcast a lot of concerts from all over the place. And also, as you remember, hair metal was kind of prevalent around those days, you know, in terms of music culture. And in there's a lot of stuff that is quite questionable, but there are some very good records that were made and some very good songs that were written as well, you know, like there were, and my brother was also very friends with a French guy who was a heavy metal fan and who had some good records in there. So that metal, quote unquote, guitar sound was there around, and that was also influential to me. Then, of course, the big discovery was Parliament Funkadelic, you know, around that time. You know, I had a friend who was like a fan of George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic, so he introduced me to, you know, Eddie Hazel, Michael Hampton, and all these guys, and I was just listening to it around that time. But again, like that was some kind of a religion in a certain way because, you know, their music is so diverse and the creativity of George Clinton and all these guys is so diverse and the music is so powerful, again, with all the message, all the messaging, all the, you know, vibration and all the creativity they managed to push through, as well as Afrocentric concepts, you know, again, which was quite formative for young people. So the Funkadelic was a very strong influence, I would say also. Jesse Johnson and all these guys, also that's a Minneapolis sound, so that's something else. That's a coming pretty much from the same place. I really loved the way the Earth, Wind and Fire guys were playing also. Alan McKay, you know, as far as rhythm guitar was quite influential. And also another aspect of creativity came from the Miles Davis, you know, electric fusion period when he used to play with Reggie Lewis, guys. So that was like, I knew the whole, you know, Miles in Silent Way, and then the Miles with Coltrane, and the Miles of Prestige, and all these things. But then when I heard Agarth and, you know, and the 1975 records, He Loved in Madly, and all these tracks, that was like something else. Because, you know, jazz, a lot of African musicians, they play jazz, or they pretend to play jazz, and it's not jazz at all. You know, it's African music with a lot of complicated chords. That's my perspective on it, and I disagree with a lot of them about that. The introduction place for me to conceive music as jazz or as spiritual jazz was the whole creativity that happened with Black American culture, Black American jazz, starting from the 1970s onwards, because those guys were now using percussion, playing these lengthy pieces, you know, talking about spirituality, wearing these African dresses, and playing numbers where it's more about modern music and creativity and, you know, like improvising on the spot. So that's a place where you can actually fit as an African quote unquote musician, because you don't have the whole gospel, blues, and bebop and harmonic background that you have to master, which we don't, you know, we can't in a certain way. But jamming along to what Pete Kosey was doing with Miles Davis and practicing it for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, then there's a way for you to conceive improvisation in a different way. So that, for me, that was an eye-opening experience, because that's how I actually realized that, hey, it's possible to do something creative with the guitar, but you really have to find harmonic ways where your creativity can be expressed. And if you, the same for playing the blues. I never tried playing the blues, actually, because it's too difficult. It's too difficult.
Wow.
I mean, you can, those British guys, they spend like, and many of them were fortunate enough to be able to learn from the masters themselves. They went to America, they went to see B.B. King, Howlin' Wolf, and all these guys. They would sit down at their feet and grab a little something out of it. So some of them managed to play guitar in a certain way with a bluesy tone that is okay, but it's not blues. And if you don't have the opportunity to go and study with those guys, you can't play. I can listen to it and be inspired by it, but I cannot play it. And I wouldn't jump on a stage and say, okay, let's do a 12-bar blues and I'm going to play solo. No, no, no. No, I wouldn't do that. No, I wouldn't do that. But play now, or jam on an A minor or E minor and play with a bluesy feeling, that's a bit more in my range. So that's how I rate myself as a guitar player, basically. And that's how influences have to be digested, to be, you know, revamped in a truthful and meaningful way, because that's the most important thing, to make music that's meaningful. And for African musicians, for a long time, I think the conversation has been about, oh, every type of music that was originated in the New World comes from Africa. And now we know that it's not true, that every nation that is there, and especially the Black American nation, they've been there for quite a long time. And most of the music forms that originated from there and from nowhere else. You know, you can be all blues come from Africa because of the Kora and no, that's not.
No, I really appreciate that respect for our own like ethnogenesis, and you know, like I mean, like everybody has their cultural thing and everybody has their roots, but it's what they do with it, you know, like I could look, like I'm into all kinds of music myself, love music on the African continent, love music from Europe, love music from Asia, but everybody has their way of doing things and expressing, and they've all had their own, how could I say it, their own way of cultivating what they did, and it's their own original thing. So I really appreciate like what you just said, because some people will try, you know, some people will try to take it away from us in that regard, you know, and say that we're not creative and we have no culture and all that. And, you know, obviously that's not true, you know, but yeah, I think it's all about complimenting, you know, the the how could I say it, the uniqueness of all of our cultures, man. And so I really appreciate you saying that, man. Seriously, you
And I
know.
think And I think Fela Kuti is probably the greatest African musician. I mean, the way he's reckoned worldwide, because he never shadowed about the fact that he got everything he got from traveling to the US in 1969 and
Mm,
learning about Black Power, learning about James Brown, learning about the funk, learning the fact that he was not a jazz player, because again, he thought he was playing jazz
wow.
with the High Life. He was playing with Kula Lobitos. He thought he was playing jazz. And he says himself in the autobiography, he talks about the fact that I thought I was a jazz player and I went to America and I went to clubs and I listened to guys playing and I realized I didn't know nothing about nothing. And
Yeah.
I certainly wasn't a jazz player. You know, he acknowledged it himself. And then he talked to Sandra Isidore and then he talked to her about African history and she talked back and she actually taught him about African history. And he says himself, that Black American woman taught me about my culture and my history. Because around that time in Africa, we weren't teaching our pre-colonial history. We weren't learning about it, and we were teaching about it in school. That happened much later. Even me, when I was a youngster, the history programs weren't the way they are now. You know,
Wow.
we weren't learning necessarily about, pre-colonial Africa, in the 1980s. That started probably after the first devaluation in 1994. So I
Man.
think from 1995, 6, 7 onwards, that's when the young people started learning more about their own history. Before we didn't learn about that.
Yeah,
You know,
it
there's a
was
lot
great
of
to like chime in
misconceptions.
myself, you know.
There's a lot of misconceptions. I mean, and even with African music, I think a lot of things have to be talked about, dealt with, and reevaluated, under a different light. And that would create a better conversation between, musicians and especially African musicians. What do they have to offer? What do they have to propose, that's meaningful so that, that can be an exchange, musically, you know. And that's the main problem that we see now is that people have been going there, performing, working for years and years and years, but they haven't proposed anything substantial in in an artistic, way or under a creative light, just like that music that we call now Afrobeats. What is it?
I was
You
gonna
know,
ask you about that, but like elaborate. I was gonna ask you about that, and I'm wondering if you're gonna say the same thing that I was gonna ask you about. But let me hear what you have to say first before
well,
I ask the question.
so that's for a few people who might be interested in it. If you go on my website, there's a page where you can see that we were working on a musical television show years ago in Nairobi, Kenya. And most of the big Afrobeat stars that you see in America now, Burna Boy, Yemi Alade, Diamond Platinums from Tanzania, and all these guys, they were on that TV show actually. And I was the music director for that TV show. That was a very important experience for me because around that time, I wasn't necessarily listening to the modern African music of the day. It was like 2014, 15, around that time. So I went there, met all these young musicians, very good musicians, especially in Nairobi. And we put that band together, backed all these artists, and did that television show that was very popular on the continental level. And that also, because it was funded by Coca-Cola, got some people in the business in America interested by it. And so some of the stars who actually were on that TV show got a platform to travel to America and start their careers in America. Burna Boy, I think, is the one who was very talented, obviously. He benefited a lot from it. My perspective on it is that, unfortunately, the music, the young people are very talented. These artists are talented. I'm not questioning that. But I don't think the musical message and the musical creativity in terms of a new musical movement, because that's how it was sold and presented to the public. It was presented as a new musical force, a new musical movement, something different. Even in terms of the whole packaging of it, the way the people dress, the way they mimic in their videos and stuff, that's pretty much coming from Black American culture. That's
Mm,
the way they dress, the way they talk, the way they position themselves. If you talk about the image that they have, if you talk about the sound that they have now, it's basically a lot of Caribbean influence in terms of the beat and the club in terms of the way the club goes. So there's not much African about it apart from the language they sing in. You know, the fact that they sing in pidgin or in, you know, African languages, their own native languages. And I think the phenomenon in terms of music was a bit overblown, the way it was
Mm.
presented. Yes. And there's not much cultural sustenance to it to actually make it, you know, a long-term musical force, just like you had with reggae music. You may like or may not like reggae music, but you can't deny the fact that that's a creative musical force that evolved through the years, you know, changed through the different musical eras, and is still very vibrant today.
Oh yeah.
You know, and a lot of people, even though it's not very popular in terms of, you know, promotion in the media and stuff like that. If you say a reggae festival and you put a few big reggae names in there, Burning Spear, all these guys, you're gonna pack the place. There's gonna be a lot of people in there. But in terms of Afrobeat, I think, I think there was a bit of a political agenda behind there in terms
Yeah.
of.
What kind of political agenda? I'm curious. And then I
I
have
would,
some things to ask you based on the app. Yeah, I want to hear the political agenda, and then I have a question that I'm going to ask you about that.
I would
Like
say,
about like.
I would say that the way Afrobeat presented itself, it presented itself as on the grounds of we are an African music force that is going to teach people about the quote-unquote greatness of African culture, or we are coming to bring you the African half in your culture that you guys didn't have. You know, I
Huh.
remember that's how it was packaged in the beginning, you know, African giant and all that stuff, you know, and, you know, the fact that, hey, this is something African that you guys need and you guys want, and that you guys didn't know you needed or didn't know you wanted, but here it is, you know, and this is going to bring something better or something different, or this is going to bring something to you guys that you guys didn't know. And that, I think, was the pivotal mistake, because, you know, the African element was never brought by African musicians to the Black American creatives or artists. It's the other way around. It's the Black American creative or artists who, in the title of their songs, starting from the late 1950s, were claiming Africa, were, you know, even the covers of those jazz records where you see those African masks, you
Yep.
know, Max Roach with a freedom suit, you know, all these things. So Miles Davis, Fille de Kilimanjaro, Miles Davis talking about
Art
Kilimanjaro,
Ensemble of
Nefertiti and
Chicago
all this,
too.
you
Yep.
know,
Art Ensemble of Chicago as well.
yeah,
I know one of the
exactly.
members lives in France
Yeah,
right now too. But yeah,
for, for,
they were really all about that.
so people in America already know about Africa. They already studied Africa. And even Manu Dibango, Soul Makossa was a huge hit. That's the Black American community who made Soul Makossa a big hit. You know, it's not the other way around, you know. And so
Wow.
it's not like Africans say, oh, we're going to bring you. No, they heard that and they say, oh, this is cool. Let's put it, you know, up there, you know. It's not.
Social Theft had something to add. I didn't really realize. I'm sorry, I just saw your comment. Social Theft. One of them was she's all. Is there a band, for example? I didn't. I'm sorry, I didn't know what you were meaning. But and she was saying in regards to Afro beats. Um, so it was to civilize the people that she was asking that.
I think not to civilize, but I think it was the way the Afrobeats was presented. It was presented as an African cultural force that was actually coming to America to bring more Africanness, quote unquote, to Black Americans. And
Huh.
that's for me, that's the pivotal mistake just right there.
And in regards to saying even what I was mentioning at first, I think people just think of Africa as one big, oh, that's the representation of, yeah, a whole continent. No. And even the regions, and this comes to my other question that I was going to ask based on Afro beats versus Afro beats. Like,
Hmm?
it's funny, people would think that like they're hearing this and that, okay, that just comes from Africa. It's like the only thing. Well, there's so many different things. I mean, you got in the East with the whole Ethiopics thing, which was also Black American influence, but that's their own flavor. You got the Juju, you know, like King Sunny ID and all these cats,
Yeah.
and you know, like just so many different things that like that represent, you know, Africa. And I'm only naming a few of them, as
Yeah.
you know, and you know it even more than I do. There's so much, so many
Yeah.
different things, like, you know, like so many different styles of music, and man, I mean, it's very eclectic. But the question that I had, it's weird. When I first started hearing of Afro beats, I thought they were mispronouncing it because you know, I don't really listen
Mhm.
to like a lot of new stuff, and I'm like, you mean like Fela Kuti? And oh, no, it's kind of different. It seemed like, and I'm not trying to sound like a hater,
No,
like
no.
it was kind of a more sort of subdued thing versus Fela was like a revolutionary, you
Yeah.
know, like that brother, like that stuff hits you in the
Yeah.
face like James Brown. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, you played with Tony Allen, so
Yeah.
you know, like just like,
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think as far as like, how could I ask this question?
No,
God,
please.
man,
Just
it's
be a
hard.
straight shooter. No problem. Just be a straight shooter. No problem. You know, no
Okay,
problem.
would you say there's a massive difference, not just in sound, but in ideology comes to Afro beats versus Afro beat? I hope
Definitely.
that's
Definitely. And that's the main issue, actually. That's the main problem is that Fela's music and Fela's cultural movement was all about the inspiration he got from the Black Power movement, not only politically, but culturally, mostly culturally.
mm,
That's why Fela was so adamant about culture, the way he dressed, the way his dancers dressed, you know, like traditional Yoruba culture. That's his dancers, that's the way they were dressed. The ladies in his band who were the backup singers were dressed in a very, you know, very fashionable way. That's again another facet of the traditional Yoruba culture. And the way the musicians were dressed, they were dressed like James Brown's band, but in an African version, the way the styling and the. So when the Afrobeats movement came along, I understand the fact that it's a different era, you know, it's a different time, so you cannot replicate what Fela did in the 1970s in the 2020 or something. But where's the African element in there, you know? Where's the African element? For real, the situation in Africa, as well, whether it might be political, you know, social, economic, we know how it is, you know, it's difficult and we have a lot of problems to fix, a lot of things to do, a lot of work to do. So the music at least has to reflect a little bit of it, you know. When you listen to reggae music, it reflects the situation, the condition of the people. You listen to Cuban music, it reflects the situation of the people. Brazilian music, it's all about this, you know. But Fela was the main cultural figure that was actually a political force. There were a few other African artists who managed to get on that level. I'm thinking about someone like Uza in Senegal. He was also a very political force. He was someone very, very important to reckon. Lucky Dube in South Africa. That's another example of musicians who had a political stance, but not that many. And the new generation, their motto is that, hey, the life is difficult. Young people, they want to party. They don't want to hear about no trouble. They want to hear about no politics. And so that's why our music is just about party, party, party. Yeah, money, money. We throw money in our videos and we party and we party and we party. But the problem with that is that that can only last a certain time. And when the time changes, when political situation is changing or evolving, when the society is moving to a harsher place or more difficult place, then the musical creation is not, you know, I would say it's not relatable anymore. And that's the problem with that music is that when you listen to it now, okay, a few good tracks, a few good dance tracks. I was at that party, that song was played and I was dancing, it was fine. But apart from that, you don't have that much substance that you can get out of it. And that was my problem with it, is that when we were working on a TV show, I was very adamant about having musical arrangements that were very strong, dance with a lot of horns and stuff like that, to compensate with the fact that even though the musical, the substance of the message in the songs might not be that important socially, if the music is very strong and the melodies are okay, then you can at least start building something. And maybe from out of there, creative artists can take on and create music with a bit more cultural or social, you know, substance to it. But very, very early on, unfortunately, people came with the name and the concept of Afrobeats, which was a direct relationship with Fela. And when you say Afrobeat, oh, everybody thinks about Fela. And even Burna Boy, the way he introduced himself was like he was the modern day Fela in a certain way.
Oh.
But again, I don't think that the music is that strong. That's the main problem again, because if the music doesn't stand the test of time, there's not much you can say about it. And that's the main problem with our cultural, actually, revolution that we have in Africa now, is that we have now the technological means and access to social media, and some of our artists are, you know, I would say global icons in terms of success and streaming and view counts on YouTube or whatever. But we don't have any real respect, artistic respect. You know, the only one who gets it is Fela. For example, Manu Dibango, from my country, Cameroon, as you know, was a global icon when he was alive. Manu passed in 2020. Who's talking about Manu right now?
I was going to ask you because you said that, I mean, I know like you mentioned him being a mentor
Yeah.
in what I read about you. So expound on, for people that don't know who Manu Dibango is, talk about him and just like even his legacy and also his influence and how he mentored you and what you do, if you don't mind me asking.
Yeah, no problem. Manu was Manu was one of the very first Africans who migrated to France in the early 1950s. And Manu's life, in a certain way, if you want to talk about the music, but also about the other side, which is his personal life, is a very clear, very crystal clear picture of the relationship that we as Africans have with French, the former, you know, colonial power in a certain way, which is Manu was the most educated and skillful musician you'd ever meet. Manu was actually fortunate enough to live through those times and follow every single step of the musical evolution of the creation of modern African music. Manu was, for example, playing with the Congolese guys. As you know, the Congolese guys, they created African rumba, which was the first.
About that too. I have a question,
Yeah.
man. You're hitting all the questions. I have a question about that. But yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
No problem. No problem. Yeah, so Manu was able to play with Kabasele and all these guys in Brussels in the early 1960s, and then traveled to Kinshasa, where again, after the, you know, Lumumba and all the revolutionary period when Mobutu got in power, then again, even though Mobutu was a kind of a very harsh political leader, he was also someone who was very supportive of the arts. That's why there was so much creativity coming out from the Congos around that time. And Manu was able to go through that and to live in Kinshasa, to work with Kabasele, to have his first cabaret there in Kinshasa. Then and also he went to France. He worked with all of these great French stars. Manu was the first black musician in France to work as a music director on a TV show in 1967 in France.
Wow.
And then he had the opportunity to work with that record label that was owned by a very rich French lady who was producing his music that was very, I would say, experimental for an African musician around that time. And she's also the person who produced the famous, you know, record Oboso, where you had the Soul Makossa track on it. So he went through all that creative period, and Manu was really, he was a musical genius to me, you know. His musical knowledge and his musical compositions, especially his period from the early 1970s till, I would say, mid 1980s, was a great period of creativity for him. But the main problem with Manu is that he never really wanted to get involved in politics. He never really wanted to do political commentary. He didn't live in Africa, contrarily to Fela. He lived in France. You know, he was based in France, permanently based in France. So he was working with African musicians, yes, but in France, and traveling back and forth between France and the African continent. So I think that's the main, you know, difference between him and Fela, which is many of the African youth, they cannot relate to Manu the same way they would relate to Fela. If you wanted to see Fela, you went to the shrine on a Saturday night and Fela was there playing with his band. If you wanted to see Manu, you had to wait when Manu would actually travel to Cameroon and go play the biggest venue in town where only the, you know, rich people in town can go and pay a ticket to go and see him perform in the hall. That was pretty much the relationship that he had with African audiences, because he was actually a huge star, so playing only in the best venues or in the stadium sometimes. But he wasn't that accessible, you know. And his music is very complex, also to a certain extent. He's using a lot of harmonies, a lot of, you know, changes, a lot of stuff. Sometimes a bit too much, you know. especially later on in his life. So when you listen to his music, it doesn't sound like quote unquote African immediately. Again, there's a strong African influence in there, but you wouldn't identify it as, you know, viciously African, the same way Fela's music is. So I think that's the main difference. You know, I was able to work with him, but he mentored me. But I never played with him. You know, I never played with him in band or anything. You know, that's the Cameroonian way of mentoring people, which is I put you in the harshest situation possible, and I'm gonna, you know, sit on the corner and wait to see if you drown. And if you don't drown, I'm not gonna say anything. You just manage to survive, and you know that's cool. Let's let it, you know. So yeah, he wasn't also very. He wasn't a great teacher. You know, Fela was a harsh teacher, but Fela was a teacher. You know, which means that Fela. You can name a lot of musicians who became influential. Even Tony Allen and a few others made some Afrobeat bands after playing with Fela. Even now, Dele Sosimi, who used to be keyboard player for Egypt 1980s, is in London. He's playing music, creating music. Manu was a bit more a loner in a way. That's how he was brought up also, and that was his personal life in France when he arrived here early on. So he had pretty much that career where he changed musical styles all through the years, and he kept his profile as a personal quest, personal musical quest, not a genre music quest. You know, contrarily to Fela, who really wanted to, you know, imprint something that he wanted to make sure that people would hear Afrobeat music and say, "Oh, this is African," right away, which is
So
a bit different from Manu.
your album Radio Masoda, or am I saying it right? Radio Masoba,
Masoda?
um, um, Masoda is dedicated to Manu, right? Like from
Yeah,
what I've read.
yeah, because again, I was very shocked to see that. I was actually hoping that when he passed, that, you know, because he spent so much time here in France and because he spent so much time working with French musicians, French orchestras, and he was also a believer in that world music, quote unquote, genre, you know, that, as we know now, is something that is also questionable, you know, because it doesn't stand the test of time again. But I really thought that people actually pay a, you know, respectful tribute to him, and no one did, you know. The musicians who were working with him, the record companies who actually were, even a proper release of Manu Dibango, a proper re-release of Sol Makossa or something, you know, Sol Makossa's 50 years, Sol Makossa was 2023, you know, because the record was actually released in 1973. I thought something would actually be done with this. I tried with the Cameroonian government, and it didn't happen. So I was like, no, we have to pay a tribute to Manu because he was an important African musician. That's one of the problems that we have, is that, you know, when our elders go, we don't remember,
Wow.
you know, we don't pay homage, and then it disappears. And then 10 years after that, you know, young Cameroonian musicians can actually come onto the scene and don't even know who Manu Dibango is, or don't really know how to play his music or what he stood for. So again, I'm getting a bit older right now, so I think those kind of things, you just have to do them in order to make sure that, you know, his musical quote unquote footprint stays there, at
Lives
least, you
on.
know, for generations.
That's really cool that you did that too. And plus, that song within itself that's the song that I probably know the most, and it's such a classic. And for the longest, I didn't know, who it was myself until later. You know, I have to ask this, not to shift the subject, because I think, I'm glad that you're touching on this, because I wanted to talk about him, because a lot of people don't know, including myself. I didn't know much about him, and now I have somebody with a direct connection to him, and I'm glad that we're doing this interview to talk about that. You worked with Wyclef too, right?
Yeah, yeah,
How was
yeah.
that?
That was that was in Nairobi again, you know, because he was the main star on the Coke Studio Africa finale show. So the first year they had another guy, a singer, you know, who was like the Coke Studio star of the day. But on season 2, they managed to get Wyclef. So it was, for me, it was a bit surreal, to be honest, because, you know, I was listening to the Fugees when I was like, you know, 20 something years old, you know, when
Yeah.
the first album came, the score came, all these songs. So it was quite an experience because, you know, we didn't have that much time. And also, when you have a guy who's on that level, to be quote unquote music directing for him is a very uncomfortable position, you know, because you cannot really tell him, hey, let's do this, or you're going to do this. It's pretty much you're following his lead and trying to, you know, bring a little bit of ideas here and there, you know, to spice it up a bit. But you mostly have to work around his ideas. And he was kind of cool. He was kind of gracious, and I think the main thing that I learned from him was watching him work in the studio, because he was working on post-production. He wanted everything to be done before he was actually leaving the country. So he stayed in Nairobi for like 3 or 4 days. So we rehearsed the first day, we shot the second day, the third day we're in the studio doing overdubs, and the fourth day he was like kind of a quote unquote mixing in the studio. So seeing him working with his team, the kind of professional attitude that he had was very interesting. In terms of the song that we did, it was a song that he worked on with a DJ called Avicii, you know, that Swedish guy who passed. I think around that time, Wyclef was collaborating with this guy. He was a Swedish DJ who passed. So there was quote unquote Wyclef's tribute to that guy, you know. Again, that song is on the playlist of those Coke Studio videos on my, you know, website. So it's not, I would have preferred working on a proper Wyclef song in a certain way, but it was a quote unquote stepping stone, because, you know, again, working on that level really helps you to, you know, raise the bar a little bit in terms of your, you know, your skills, you know, as a producer, quote unquote, you know. So it was an interesting experience, you know, really, definitely, yeah.
That's awesome. Oh, by the way, I remembered, how could I forget my own friend's name that lives there? Her name was Mildred Akok, like, or Achoch.
Oh,
I don't know if I'm saying it right, but that's the lady
okay.
that I was talking about,
Yeah.
from works with Rafiki and all that.
Rafiki Festival in Nairobi,
Yeah. I have to, I want to quote something that you wrote that I thought was really cool. And then I'm going to ask the next question after that. I love this a lot. And me and Dewan were kind of touching on this last night. I want to tear down the barrier that separates African music from the mainstream. I want to get inside of that space and bring enough African flavor in the rock and roll world to create a distinction. Oh, did I say that right? A distinctive sound. That sounds really cool, man. Like, and I want you to expound off of what I think I know what you meant by it, and I think it's so cool. But like, and then man, I got questions upon questions. I want you to expound off of that.
I think.
Sorry, I'm like.
No. I think that now African music is at a stage where we, as you said, you know, we have so many styles, especially in the traditional area of African music. And by listening to more and more traditional music, I'm realizing that, you know, it's actually from there that we have to start to basically create something that can actually be a real advancement in a certain way. Because as we were discussing previously, we had the creation of modern African music with the rumba in the 1950s, 1960s. Then we had that great period of creativity, 1970s, up until the early 1980s, where the whole world music thing started. And for me, that's when everything came to a crash, because, you know, you had all these great African artists, and now we're traveling to Europe to actually use all these synthesizers and drum machines and fuse it with the African sound that wasn't already clearly defined to me, you know, because it was too diverse. You know, yes, you have Congolese soukous, then you have this in South Africa. Yeah, but it's all very scattered in a certain way. You know, it's not something that you can really put your hands on. Like, when you say blues, you know what it is. When you say jazz, you know what it is. When you say reggae, you know what it is. When you say batucada, you know what it is. When you say African music, you don't really know what it is. You know, it can mean so many different things at the same time. So the starting point of that reflection was when we were working on a TV show, because artists were coming from all over the African continent, and the musicians in the band were from different places, you know. So we weren't all Cameroonians or all Kenyans or all Congolese. We were from everywhere, pretty much. And Cameroon being in that very specific geographic location in Africa, which is, they say Cameroon is like the Africa in a summary, because you have all different kind of climates in Cameroon. You have the desert, we have the forest, we have the high plains, we have the mountains with the snow in Cameroon.
Wow.
And also it's a real transitional place from West Africa to Central Africa and then to South Africa. You have to go through Cameroon to go from one place to another in the continent. So I think that's also part of our upbringing, to be very open-minded, because all kind of rhythms and people actually were crossing through that place at some point. And when we were working on a TV show, I just realized that the fact that we are able to work with so many different artists and hear these different languages, and the BGVs, they weren't singing that Uganda language, but they had to learn that language for this song, and then they had to learn some Yoruba stuff in this other song, and then they had to learn stuff from South Africa for this other song, because the artists were coming from there. And I was like, well, how can we now fuse these different melodic influences in order to create an African sound that would actually be representative of the African beat in a certain way? Fela managed to do it with Afrobeat, even though it's very much Yoruba influenced. And in the same manner, my idea was that, okay, we are now in a phase of history where we are influenced by Black American music, we're influenced by hip hop, we influenced by so many different things. The idea is not to create African hip hop. That doesn't make sense to me. African hip hop, it doesn't really make sense to me. Or African jazz, or African blues, or African whatever, doesn't really make sense to me. How can we go from what Fela did with Afrobeat and then now add some other influences like that weren't necessarily prevalent in African music, but you can still hear those sounds in certain African music styles, and especially in the traditional music styles, because all these wood instruments or these balafon instruments, sometimes when you hear them and they are electrified, it sounds a little bit like rock guitar in a certain way. Those kind of frequencies. When you hear those likembe sounds from Congo, they're electrified, and the amplifiers are distorted and they play, so it sounds a little bit. So in traditional music, we have a variety of sounds that can be represented in the electronic or the modern world. And that's why my idea was that, we have access to that technology now. So how can we reflect on the creativity that we have and the influences that we have in order to try to push African music in a direction that might not be fully traditional, might not be fully faithful to our respective traditional cultures, but might be leaning towards a sound that African music and African people all around could actually identify with. That was my idea.
So is that where the concept of Afroelectric, which you coined, from what I gather, came from? Is that where that came from, or is that just kind of like your style, or is that the goal that you're talking about?
I think that's one of the goals that I'm talking about, and that could define the style. But I think that's basically, that means that Africa has to plug itself into something culturally and creatively.
What do you think about bands like Kanono that they have like an electric? I think it is an electric xylophone or electric kalimba.
Yeah.
I mean, I heard that. I was like, whoa, this is a trip. Like, is that kind of closer to that, or?
Yeah. I mean, those kind of influences are very important, because again, the modern technology should allow us to go that route, go that direction more and more and more and more. And also, you cannot sing in 20,000 many different languages. You have to pick one or two, so that people can understand, or people can actually, focus on something. Bob Marley was singing in English, he wasn't singing in Jamaican patois. If he was singing in Jamaican patois, I don't think the music would have been so, internationally reckoned or understood, or, I don't think people would have gravitated to it. So those kind of questions are very important. People from Cameroon would say, "Oh, Frank, you don't sing in Bassa," which is the people from where I'm coming from are Bassa people. Yeah, but if I sing in Bassa, no one will understand. And it's not a very musical language in terms of the flow, because it's a very harsh language. Swahili, on another hand, the music, the language they speak in East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, even Rwanda, different. That's a fantastic language for melodies, fantastic. And the level of singing in East Africa is way above what we have, in Central Africa. To me, in terms of harmony, people singing together in terms of vocal harmonies, and something that sounds African again. So I've been having those conversations for a long, long, long time with African musicians, but we still have that world music mindset where people are career-based, and thinking about their own careers and thinking about, of course, you have to think about that also. How can you survive in the music world that we know is very difficult right now to survive in? But we still have the same problem, still have the same problem of musical identity, cultural identity, in terms of representation, and something we're still striving for, in my opinion. Many people would say, no, it's fine. We have this or this or this or this artist who's very successful, who's having 1 million views on streams on Spotify, and the venues are packed, so we're good. I don't think so. I think, especially now that the times are getting harsher politically, and that the situation on an economic level globally is so difficult, what really helps people to sustain themselves is the culture, It's the culture.
Yeah.
It's
It's definitely culture. Like, speaking of,
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that.
No, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
I was gonna ask. Thanks for reminding me too. Because I don't know if I've ever heard Congolese rumba, but is it different from Cuban rumba? Is there similarities, or is it just completely different? And then I had a comment about world music, but I'm gonna let you ask the Congolese rumba question.
I think the Congolese rumba, again, the birth of modern African music is two things. First and foremost, the Black American jazz of the early 1920s and 1930s, because, again, all these orchestras in Africa, you have the name jazz, Kabasele was African jazz. Franco was Tipi Oke jazz. In Guinea, you have the Bembeya Jazz National, And why the word jazz? Because for them, the word jazz, and again, Black Americans, represented the highest form of advancement in terms of swag, in terms of cultural enrichment, in terms of the leaders of the Black people in the world in a certain way, We were still under colonial rule, and you had the Harlem Renaissance, in the early 1920s. So we saw these pictures. Again, in Africa, people saw these pictures, and for them, as soon as the people got independent, first thing they did, they studied, they educated themselves, they were wearing suit and ties, and playing their music with an aspiration to be as swaggish, as creative, as thorough as the Black Americans, That's why all our orchestras and the rumba, all these orchestras have the name jazz, because for them that was the highest form of everything, the jazz and the Black American achievement, cultural achievements. And your second influence was the music that was coming from Cuba, the Latin influence. And I would say that was more about the rhythm, because again, in traditional African music, the rhythms are so strong and so powerful and so diverse that you can't even name how many we have and how powerful and strong they are. But the jazz music from Black Americans brought the structure, and the usage of the horns, and the fact that the horns were used, and so that's the first music that you hear. We had the acoustic guitars and the bongos and stuff. The horns came in later, and the Cuban influence brought us the forms of the songs. If you hear the early rumbas by Kabasele, it sounds a little bit like mambo. Those early Cuban rhythms before the salsa was created. Not really the French on salsa, but more like mambo, cha-cha-cha, all these different rhythms. So that was the first influences. So they were mimicking Black Americans musicians on one hand, and on the second hand, the rhythms coming from Cuba. That's why they call it African rumba, because it's a different form of rumba, but with the singing in Lingala and with the traditional chants that we had in our villages on top of those rhythms. So that's the birth of modern African music. And again, you see, even the birth of our modern music has Black American influence. you know,
Man,
just like Afrobeat, you know.
man. It's funny. This brother or sister says that I'm enjoying the conversation. There's no need for me to ask any questions. This is cool, man. I'm glad that you mentioned the thing about world music, and I'd made comments before, and just thinking to myself, and I think I'd asked somebody the question: why do they have to call it that? Is it just like some like okay, everything else but this? Like when you think of African music,
Mm-hmm.
it's often thought of as world music. No, nobody else. Occasionally, you might get that. No, I'll say it's always usually like African music. Like, why do they just throw like, oh, it's just in a category, like in a box, like, and you think of some kind of like, like I don't want to be insulting
No,
to
no,
any of
no.
my hippie friends, but like it's like okay, WOMAD. No disrespect to Peter Gabriel
Yeah,
because I'm a fan. Like that's or some hippie guy that just wants to be hip. I listen to world music, like
yeah,
what's
yeah.
up with that? I do have a problem with that title myself, so I'm glad that I'm not the only one.
Can definitely understand where you're coming from. You know, the thing is that I think there was something the real origins of that world music thing is the British guys, again, the British creatives, like guys like Brian Eno and all those guys, who started looking for different sounds after the whole hippie music died out in the early 1970s.
Yeah.
You know, those people started traveling to Africa. Someone like Ginger Baker went to Lagos, he recorded there, had a studio there. EMI had a studio there. And Brian Eno and all those guys started traveling back and forth, hearing Fela and all that stuff. And then the guys like Talking Heads, also, they heard
Yeah.
some Fela, and I think the Remaining Light album was very much influenced by Fela. So I think even Peter Gabriel, to a certain extent, these guys were quote unquote at least a little bit. I would say, I wouldn't say sincere, but their artistic vision was respectful to a certain extent of African culture, because when you hear they were using drums, they were using percussion, they weren't like using the whole package or trying to dilute the African sound into what they were doing. These were still rock albums or pop songs, but with an African flavor, quote unquote. The whole thing started going haywire again when in industry, that kind of African music started flourishing in France, especially. You know, there was a very important political thing that happened in France. The left wing got in power in 1981 in France, and that's the first time that it actually had happened in French history, in French political history. So as the left wing came into power between 1981 and 1983, there was a huge cultural and social, I would say, release of the French traditional right-wing values, which were like, people had more time to go on vacation. The social life became much easier in France. And after 2 or 3 years of that, the political and economic situation came to a crashing halt. And that's where the far right nationalist movements like the National Front in France started appearing in 1984, And around the same time as there were those nationalist movements that were rising, there was, on the other hand, another something that was politically instrumentalized to my extent, to my recognition. They brought up suddenly the culture that was coming from the former colonies, which is the African cultures and the cultures from North Africa, the Arab cultures, and especially those musics. So out of nowhere, suddenly, all these African music starting being pushed and promoted on French television, And it wasn't like the pure African music. Now, French musicians and producers and record companies were traveling to Africa to select the famous and good musicians, bring them to Paris, and now they're starting doing that kind of a fusion of, we're going to use those Western instruments and production techniques, and we're going to fuse it with that African sounds. And so all the even the Manu Dibango records from the 1980s, you listen to that, and you're like, what is it? You hear a drum machine, it's not really fusing well with the percussion, it's not fusing well with the traditional instruments, not fusing well with the, it's a bit of a mishmash, you know.
Mm.
And because that was popular culturally and helped France to define itself culturally, because that was a defining thing for France. Oh yeah, we are a diverse nation, quote unquote. We don't recognize the races. You know, we don't acknowledge the fact that we have different communities coming from different, you know, origins and ethnicities and stuff like that. We are just liberté, égalité, fraternité, which is liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Those are supposed to be the, you know, mottos for the French Republic, which, of course, as we know, is the reality is much different than that.
Mm.
And so from there, also another thing that was imported was the fact that they created out of the blue a French, quote unquote, hip hop culture. You know, they saw what was happening in America, and right away was, oh, those Black Americans, guys, they're living in the projects, and you guys from the French colonial empire, you're living in the banlieue, which is quote unquote the French projects. So
Mm.
there you go. We had a TV show, French television, called Hip Hop,
Wow.
HIPHO. Yeah, 1984, 1985, 6. As if there was any kind of correlation culturally, socially, or whatever with the Black Americans. So you see the identification of the Africans with the Black American culture for false reasons and under false pretexts, you know, and for with a wrong understanding of what the cultural, you know, Black American culture stands for historically, politically, you know. It's not just about guys dancing, but that's
Yep.
how French portrayed it. And it's the same
Wow.
for, yeah, and it's the same for world music, you know. So at the same time, they artificially created a world music where, hey, we can come around and you come from Botswana and we're going to put you with those guys who are producing, you know, Euro beats with those keyboards and stuff and drum machines, and we're going to fuse it together, because if it's purely African, we can't really digest it. So we have to digest it with, you know, the European fusion on top of it. And for the urban, you know, young people coming from the former colonial empire, oh, you guys are Arabs and Black guys coming from Africa. Oh, here, hip hop, and you guys are hip hop. That's why
Far out.
when I know that when you guys listen to French hip hop, you guys are, you know, rolling on the floor, laughing your asses off, because it doesn't mean anything to you guys. I know, you know, and I've met a few African musicians who are quote unquote African hip hop artists who went to the US, and when they came back, they were like, okay, I thought I was a rapper, but I'm obviously not a rapper. Many of them actually told me that, you know.
Yeah.
And that's the main problem that we have. That's the main problem that we have with world music, is that unfortunately, again, the cultural significance of the African music is not that clearly defined, you know. And if it was possible for, and it's the same for Afrobeats, you see. And after we had that great surge of creativity from the 1970s, it never really recovered from that, because then came the world music, then came there was for some time the, I would say, the Congolese sound with the Zouglou and all that stuff, with an early 1990s digital Congolese sound with the guitars was very popular. Then it went to Ivory Coast in the 2000s. They had a very popular style also there in Ivory Coast that all Africa was mimicking. And then now it's the Nigerians, and everybody's mimicking the Afrobeats, you know, and that's how it was. And Amapiano in South Africa is something that's a bit popular right now as well, but it's mostly like there was never another movement like what Fela created that sprung from the African continent, where there's a clear African identity that is established there, even though there are also some clear influences. But the result that you hear is African. When you hear Fela, you know where it's coming from, you know the influences, but it's African. All the rest of these modern African music creations, they're still questioning about it, you know, it's still questioning about it. And the main reason why it's questionable is because it doesn't stand the test of time. And world music doesn't stand the test of time. You know, now you as you see, the whole WOMAD Peter Gabriel thing used to be very popular back in the day. It's not anymore. You know, people don't really relate to that music anymore,
It's
unfortunately.
a trip. I think Peter's intention was to give light to like the situation in you know, especially in South Africa, and also the groups and the artists. But I think when, just in my humble opinion, when the whole corporate thing, like it almost like, okay, they're not looking at the individual individuals are just looking at this as just like one thing, and it's not, because there's different nuances to every person that comes from that continent. Just like, you know, you wouldn't put, like, okay, you have some Eastern European folk music and Gaelic music. How would you like if somebody did that to Europe like that and said that they were the same thing, put a title on them to kind of box that in? So it's kind of a trip just to kind of like see that with Africa. It's a whole continent full of different countries. It's the biggest continent with different countries, literally, and it's I do believe Peter actually had good intentions, but I think what came out of that was unfortunately people, and this is, I mean, I'm probably wrong, but I think like as far as like just people putting things into one box, like you're saying, like it's actually kind of disrespectful. You know what I'm saying? Correct me if I'm wrong on any of these points, especially you being an African musician, and just knowing a lot of the traditional music, and just studying all kinds of different music along with that. And also like, how could I say it? Like pioneering in even more avant-garde movement, what you're doing with Afroelectric, in my opinion. I hope that makes sense. Let me know what you think, man. I don't know.
Yeah,
as far as that, especially with Peter Gabriel's intentions,
I really agree with you. Is that I think he had some, he didn't have any bad intentions in the first place. And I think he was actually aware that maybe coming to realization that the fact that outside of rock and roll and pop music, there were some cultures that were very creative and that actually had some depth and richness to it, especially on the African continent, because they were ignored for so long, And but as you say, the main problem comes when we put everything in the same box. That's the main thing. And also I think it was possible to put all these different African genres or artists in the same box because the music genres are whether too scattered, so that there are so many that it's difficult to remember that many different names of rhythms and different variations of creative styles, within the same genre. And also the fact that very early on, artists in Africa had mostly a personal approach, career approach, not a global approach. When we had orchestras, it was way different. And when we had orchestras back in the day, it was possible for a huge song in Congo to be popular in South Africa, for a huge song in Angola to be popular in Ivory Coast, or for a huge song in Cameroon to be popular somewhere else, because music was something that was attached with the political, economic, and cultural development of the nations. And no matter what political governments were actually ruling this or that country around that time, there was a common thing about, just like the Festac in 1977 in Nigeria, those kind of political, cultural events used to happen in Africa around that time, So it was a bit easier for us to have musical movements where the standard thing was the orchestra, whether it was a Congolese orchestra or an orchestra in Ivory Coast. I remember they had an orchestra playing live on television in Ivory Coast every 2 or 3 days, music from there, but with the horns, with the singers. And you could see the same kind of orchestras in Guinea. You could see the same kind of orchestras in Cameroon, same kind of orchestras in Congo. Even though the music was a bit different, they had a common ground or a common base. Music had to be orchestral. And there was a lot of guitars in all those different styles. There was some horns, the singers and the musicians, and the singers were stars. We didn't have that barrier between musicians and singers around that time. Then with the world music thing, artists, especially the singers, were pushed forward on the foreground as the leaders and the stars. For example, Youssou N'Dour, he comes from a very famous orchestra called L'Étoile de Dakar. That was a very popular orchestra in Senegal in 1970s. And he wasn't the leader of the band. He was the singer of the band. The leader and the band leader was the guitar player. Same for Salif Keita. Salif was the singer of a band called Les Ambassadeurs du Motel de Bamako. Les Ambassadeurs. And the leader of the band was Kanté Manfila. He was the guitar player. Salif was one of the singers, you know. But when the world music era came, people who got pushed in the foreground, if you notice, they were all singers. Angelique Kidjo, she's a singer. Youssou
Yep.
N'Dour, he's a singer. Steve Keita, he's a singer. All of them were singers. Alpha Blondy, he's a singer. And then the orchestras got put in a, you know, background. The musicians got put a little bit in the background. And then it's like, oh, so we get the singer, the BGVs, and maybe the kora player, and the rest of this album, we're going to record it in France with our musicians, you know. And so from the get-go, the creation of world music, French sound engineers, musicians, and I would say even producers, and African artists had a 50-50, you know, collaboration, joint collaboration in the creation of the songs, in the creation of the products, and in the way the music was presented to the outside world, basically. And when you see those WOMADs, African bands playing, those are always, you know, diverse bands, mixed bands, you know, with European musicians and African musicians. So the whole African presentation, the whole African concept gets lost to me in a certain way in that process. And so what you get after that is, yes, African songs, African language being sung, a few traditional African instruments in the mix or in the composition or in the arrangement of the song, but you don't get a full African creation. And that's where we still are today. We're still stuck, you know. You cannot pinpoint clearly something that's coming from the African continent today, apart from the traditional music or the music that you might not know, or that the music is too typical. For example, in Cameroon, they have a music that is called Bikutsi, music from, you know, my hometown. Very specific, very Cameroonian. It's great. It's fantastic. I listen to it all the time. But how can people all across Cameroon relate to that? People in northern Cameroon, they don't listen to Bikutsi. People who in western Cameroon, close to the Nigerian border, they don't listen to Bikutsi, not that much. And then you go to Nigeria, people don't know what Bikutsi is. And you go to Gabon, people don't know what Bikutsi is. So that's why focusing on a specific style is a bit dangerous now. Back in the day, the rumba was influencing everyone. Even when you listen to Guinean music, there's a rumba bass in there, you know, in the way they play the guitar, in the structure of the songs. The Congolese rumba was so powerful because it influenced all these different African orchestras all across the continent, you know. And that's what we lost when we came to the world music era, which is from then on, guys would actually bring their knowledge or their songs, go record in Paris, then being promoted on these European or international stages as the great voice from Senegal, the great voice from Congo, the great voice from Benin. But even when you see an Angelique Kidjo performance today, she's a great singer. But it's very, you know, even a musician, I'm sure you know the bass player Richard Bona from Cameroon, a jazz bass player.
I know who.
He's based in New York. He's been based in New York for years and years. But yeah, he's a virtuoso bass player, great singer, great bass player. But the music he does is mostly, I would say, influenced by Cuban music. So it's kind of Cuba, Africa, rumba, Africa type of thing. I know a lot of musicians, African musicians, would disagree with me and would actually fight me if they heard what I say now. And when I talk to them, we always, you know, go back and forth and argue, and we disagree.
Oh man,
you know, very harshly. But that's what I see. That's what I see. And I'm trying to be honest, because if you want to progress as a musician and to create music that is valuable, you have to be honest with yourself first of all. And you cannot fake the funk with the audiences. The people know what music is. People know what music is. So if you know, and right now I see that we are still struggling with the same issues we were struggling with 20 years ago when I started, or 25 years ago when I started. I was an young African musician struggling to actually push African music forward. And now we went through all these different stages, and now when I saw Burna Boy, Madison Square Garden, you name it, and all that, I was like, okay, we reached that pinnacle, but we haven't reached that pinnacle on an artistic level. That's the problem, you know. The commercial success is there, the money is there, the streaming view count numbers are there, but the artistic respect is not there.
Wow.
You know? The same way people will respect artistically Damian Marley. People respect him on an artistic level. He's not Bob Marley, but everyone respects Damian Marley. Everyone respects him, you know? Or, you know, I don't know, like even those Brazilian musicians, I mean, they are respected on an artistic level. I don't see an artistic respect for Afrobeats, you know, like people think that it's strong. I mean, you see what's happening with Kendrick Lamar right now? I mean, he's driving the whole world crazy with his music, you know. That's respect, man.
Yep.
I mean, and
He's
talking
making some
about respect,
classic bangers. And
yeah,
his lyrics too, people are like looking at his lyrics with, I mean, I live not too far from Compton and I've met Kendrick probably a few times. I don't know him personally, but it's a trip to see somebody that local on a grand scale, and people basically are studying him in school,
yeah,
and that's awesome. Especially coming from especially I live right by Compton, no joke. Like the city that I'm from is like a little like it's south of Compton, and where I'm at is like a few blocks away from it, so it's kind of like I'm familiar, like where, like, funny thing is, one of my friends was in one of his recent videos, one of my popping friends. I do that dance, but so I was like, oh, that's so cool to see him. But it's so cool to see that guy, especially when it comes to hip hop, because people are talking about, you know, like the typical stereotypical things that people say about hip hop. And the thing is, people don't understand. There's always been lyricists that have been very deep. You know, like I could list a gang of them, but I guess cats haven't seen cats like that in a long time in the mainstream. And I'm glad Kendrick is getting that appeal because
mhm,
he's from that tradition. That's a tradition that we've had in hip hop for a long time, you know. And even people demonize the West Coast talking about our gang thing and all that. But even out here, we've had lyricists like AC Alone,
yes,
Micah Nine, you know,
yeah,
Freestyle Fellowship, all these guys, and even Ice Cube that were
yeah,
rocking some conscious stuff that
yeah,
people are like, I mean, you know, metaphors, everything, Razzcast. I mean, the list goes
yeah.
on, you know, like, so Kendrick to me is just like, you know, I'm looking at him the same way I looked at those guys that I grew up listening to, you know, back in the day and still listen to.
So, so
So it's cool to see that.
influential, so influential culturally. He's so influential culturally and so powerful musically, you know, and lyrically. It's just insane. It's just completely insane. And that's the thing, again, that we miss. That's my observation, you know, that's until we are able to produce music that really comes from us, even though it might be inspired by other genres or touch on other genres, you know, it's we're still looking for something, you know, that is actually purely African or really truly African that can resonate with everyone. You know, we had a few songs that managed to resonate with everyone. Malaika, you know, Pata Pata, Miriam Makeba, a few songs like that. There were a
Mm.
few African lines in a song. Like Nene Cherry, she had a song with Youssou it was kind of famous, an African song. You know, a few. But on it, you know, that's the thing. Fela is still so popular 30 years after his death because, you know, he stood for something, you know, on a cultural level. And also when you see him or when you listen to him, you have a clear picture and vision of Africa. And I think that's where Afrobeat is failing, to me, is that when you see them, the way they look, the way they dress, when you listen to the sound, and when you see what they are talking about, you don't have a clear picture of Africa. You know,
Mm.
you don't have a clear understanding of what Africans people stand for. You don't have a clear picture of what African culture is moving towards or moving to. That's why I say when they came to America a few years ago with the new music trend that is going to blow the whole thing and, you know, rejuvenate the scene and stuff like that, because that's how, you know, they were presented when Afrobeat started blowing up and going to the Grammys and stuff. They even brought in Grammy award categories for Afrobeats, you
Yeah,
know,
I tripped
which is
out on that. I'm like, wait,
unheard
and that's why I was like, it
of.
was all new to me, you know, and because I'm
Yeah.
used to Fela, you know, I'm like, is this? But I'm like, okay, Afro beats with an S. I'm like,
Mm.
what? You know, I didn't know, so I had to ask that question, you
And
know.
it didn't really make sense because the music wasn't there for that long. It took how many years
No.
before they put a reggae music category
Or
at
even
the
hip
Grammys?
hop.
Yeah,
like a long time.
20 something years is like 15, 20 years, how many years, and then that music trend that was just born yesterday, boom, you had the Grammys there, it's, you see, and that's when things are done like that, for me, it's questionable
Yeah.
because there must be some kind of a political agenda behind
Agenda.
there,
I was thinking the same thing.
and and not not really beneficial to African music or African culture in the long run, because now this music style, everybody talks about it as a fade, and it's still supposed to be growing up and moving forward. But everyone is saying, hey, I'm hearing everywhere when I'm talking to producers and stuff like that, oh yeah, this is simple and easy music, nothing special about it, and no one goes crazy for it.
Wow.
Like no one goes crazy for it worldwide. I'm talking about, I mean, you see the music, the level of music in the churches, in gospel, modern gospel music. How can someone sit down, listen to that, and be like, "Oh yeah, this is cool"? No, no.
Nah.
Even even
You're gonna be
musicians,
up.
you know, even musicians
You're gonna
from
get hit by somebody like an old lady with a fan, man. And then gospel chops cats like, man, they got that street element with those drumming styles. And yeah,
yeah,
man, no, you can't sit down to no gospel music. You're gonna shout.
yeah. See, so that's the problem that I have, is that, when I see something that is supposed to be benefiting or uplifting the African culture, and then after so much time, so much money that's been invested in that genre, because those videos are like millions of dollars, that's music investment. When I know how much talent there is on the African continent, how many talented artists there are just in Kenya and Nairobi alone, or Cameroon alone, leave alone all these different other countries, and I see how much money was invested in that music style, Afrobeats, that was supposed to be basically the new urban genre that is better than hip hop, better than dancehall, better than R&B, better than so. That's how it was marketed. That's how it was marketed, and that's where I was like, "Hey, there's something wrong in there, There's something
Yeah,
wrong there."
I like the
Because I
old.
know.
I'm sorry.
No, 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 please, go ahead.
I like Afro beat. I can't get into the Afro beat stuff. I mean, like what the Afro beats, because I mean, like it's just too. It subdues me a bit. Like I don't know if that makes sense. Like I feel too like. I mean, I listen to stuff that's easy. I ain't gonna lie, but it's just like it just
Mm-hmm.
doesn't do it for me. And I'm not dissing anybody. I mean, cats are cool at what they do. It's just a different taste. But I like Afro beat a lot. That stuff will get you up. It's
Yeah,
like, I mean, I like funk. I like James Brown. Fela is like, it's like he took cues from James Brown and did like something that was uniquely,
yes,
his own. Like you were saying, and it's still strong.
yeah,
None of that stuff will have you just like, yeah, I'm chilling. Nah, it's gonna hit you in the face, bro. Like
yeah,
that's what it's just like, man. And this brother can go on for a long time with it too. Like I mean,
yeah.
man, yeah, that was just powerful stuff.
Definitely, definitely. And also, yeah, so that's why, as you were asking the question about, the Afroelectric, and where we are trying to go, or what are the hopes and aspirations for African music in the future. I would really hope that younger musicians will, first of all, spend time learning and listening, because that's the problem that we have also. Learning and listening,
Mm.
and learning and listening other cultures, not to mimic it, but to understand what it is, to understand what it is. Just like I was telling you, I do not consider myself a blues guitar player, and I will never consider myself a blues guitar player. But I spent so much time listening to great blues artists and to understand where they are coming from. And when you think about where they are coming from, that helps you to reflect on your culture, where you are coming from,
Mm.
and what's bad about you. And that's what Fela did. When he left America, he went back to Nigeria, where it was difficult, and he stayed there. That's the main difference also between him and all the world music guys. They were all living in Europe or in France mostly. Manu lived in France all his life. Fela lived in Lagos all his life, and he was harassed by the police. His house was burned down, blah, blah, blah. He never left Lagos, never.
Yeah.
you know. That's one of the things as well. And me, as I was getting older, I made sure I was like, no, no, no. You have to go back to Africa, to Nairobi or to Yaoundé, to work with younger musicians, to learn what's happening on the ground. Even now, the new project that we have is, yes, I'm working, I'm writing the songs and producing, but it's a band. And the younger guys are fronting the band because, you know, it's difficult to be sold as the new kid on the block when you're 50 years old, you know, basically. And also it's a position for me that I have that quote unquote recognition to push the younger musicians in the band. You know, the ladies who sing, we have a 6-piece band, and the young drummer is incredible, the bass player is incredible, because as again, we're thinking about how can we change the perception. It's all about perception, and not perception, fake perception, but real perception, the perception about ourselves first, and how we can present ourselves to the world on an artistic level. I'm sure that Africa has something to say or something to offer, but I'm also sure that the roads we've been taking so far are not the right ones, you know. And now the world has moved so fast and to such a different extent that now we are pretty much backs against the wall. That's my observation in terms of artistic creation and artistic proposal, you know. Now,
I did have a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, my
no,
bad.
please go ahead. No, please go ahead.
Even with that, especially when we're talking about rock and roll, one of the first rock bands I ever heard from Africa via my father was Osabisa. And I know they weren't all just African either. I think there's a few Caribbeans, maybe even one American in the band.
Yeah.
But also there's been different rock movements in Nigeria and Zambia, and even in, like in the 70s, and then in South Africa in the late 70s, early 80s, with the whole punk rock thing. But also there's a new, in Botswana, there's like a metal scene and all that. What's your take on a lot of those movements? And do you feel like some of them were kind of, or any of those were kind of authentically African? I love the Zamrock stuff. You can still hear things. And I also like the fact that they were influenced by like a lot of Black American garage and blues music too. You know, but I'm just curious about your take on that as well. Do you feel the same with that form of rock and roll, or is it still kind of the, you know, I'm just curious.
I think the fact that you mentioned Osibisa is really very important because Osibisa was, again, apart from Fela, I think it's one of the very few great African musical achievements in terms of originality. Just like you say, there were some Caribbean musicians in the band. There was I think the lead guitar player was a Black American musician, and also they were coming from Nigeria and Ghana.
Yeah.
So different African countries. You know, and that's also something that is very important in terms of, you know, who we are as Africans. Because the way I see it is that as soon as we start having multiple influences in an African band or an African concept, things are moving at a much faster pace and are way more interesting in terms of musical creativity or artistic creativity in general. Because again, these notions of African nations that we have are very fragile and very recent, you know, to a certain extent. You know, most African countries became independent in 1960, which is yesterday, you know. Like,
I wasn't long ago.
Very recent. And even 100 years ago, when my great-grandfather was alive, there was no Cameroon, you know, and he wasn't even thinking in terms of Cameroon. They were thinking in terms of people, in terms of, you know, lineage, in terms of clans, you know, or gatherings, or, you know, people who had different interests in terms of how they would trade and stuff like that. So it was a complete different mentality. So I think the revolution that we are expecting in terms of African advancement has to start from the arts first and foremost. But if it starts from the arts, it has to start from a virgin place, which is you start from a blank canvas and you bring forth what you know in order to create a different mix. And of course, we have also to take influence from the strong Black cultures and Black expressions that are existing out there, because that's a bedrock for us, even though that might not be coming from the African continent, you know. What you were talking about also, some scenes in the Zamrock scene, or there's also a metal scene in Kenya.
Botswana,
you know,
yeah.
You know, called
And
Rush.
Kenya
There was
too, yeah. I forgot about how could I forget about that? That's why I interviewed Mildred, because there's some really cool alternative stuff that
yeah.
I've been hearing from Kenya and metal and even some like kind of like almost punk or heavy rock stuff, you know?
So I think that's really, really, really very good that musicians, first of all, are, free enough and have a, clear head in terms of not being, not fearing being judged or being ridiculed because they actually are interested in these different kind of musical forms, which are not very relatable in terms of African culture. But I
Mm.
think in order to make it something that would now be really creative, the main thing that we must do is that we have to select a form, an artistic form that we can all follow, For example, I'm talking about reggae. Reggae, they decided to map themselves on the Black American tradition of songwriting and harmonies,
Yep.
And then they did that with their Jamaican culture, Jamaican influence, Jamaican sensibility, artistic sensibility. But they rooted the reggae concept in terms of there has to be a song and there has to be vocal harmonies. This is the main thing. Then the rhythm is something different, but songs and harmonies. Or for the ska, there was like the horns and the beat,
Yep.
which was influenced by blue beat and stuff. For African music, that's the kind of I would say reflection that we gotta have in order to now that the rumba era is over and that the world music era is also doomed and that the Afrobeats era is slowly gonna decline bit by bit, I think, because it's not really sustainable. It's more about um, how can we now uh, bring forth different elements in order to create an African fusion of different African influences, but also, just like I was saying, drawing elements from Black American culture. For me, in some that we select and use as a bedrock, in order to have a structure. The main problem is structure. When you listen to an African Congolese song, it can go on for 7 minutes or anything like that. Fela managed to create a structure that is so long. You see, those Fela music pieces are like 15 minutes,
Yeah.
17 minutes. But he chose a structure and he never moved from that structure, that
Very
musical structure.
hypnotic.
Starting with the horns, solos, then the vocals, then back to the horns. We don't have a structure, or we haven't selected a clear structure on which we can actually now proceed from. If you say, okay, we're going to base ourselves on songs or songwriting, now that's something that is completely different from African tradition in terms of we have chants, not necessarily songs. The Congolese had songs in rumba, there was song, but very complicated songs, very intricate melodies, very intricate harmonies, and not really sustainable in terms of musical clarity. So those are for me in terms of Afro rock. I would say Osibiza is a good starting point, because the rhythms are clear and the musical structures are simple. There's a jazz element to it because you have horns on it. There's another Nigerian band called Blow. I don't know if you know that band, Blow, BLO, from Nigeria, early 1970s as well. There was like a power trio, like quote unquote, power trio, Nigerian
I
power
know I
trio.
featured one. What was it? Was it an acronym? Because there's one band, and I don't know why it's like not coming to me. And they were so heavy from Nigeria that just blew my mind.
I think it's
How could I?
Blow.
Man,
Probably BLO. Yeah, BLO. I think that's the one you're talking about because they're like a real power trio. They were influenced by Cream and these different bands. They're
yeah, I thought
playing
it
in
was
a
like
very
what is it? Artillery something. I wrote about them. I'll look at them. I'm like, I don't know why I'm forgetting stuff now. Forgot my
those
own
Afro
friend's name and now this
those
band.
Afro rock compilations, right? Afro rock compilations, right? That
Yeah,
were released. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I see what you mean. No, I think
yeah, man.
those Nigerian bands also were very important because they weren't shy about drawing influences from abroad. Like they were influenced by the rock scene in London. They were influenced by the rock bands in America, like War, you know, these different bands, even the way they were dressing and stuff like that. So
West of
I
Long
think,
Beach, by the way, where I'm from.
yeah, yeah.
My dad knew a few of those guys. Yeah, I have to mention that.
No, definitely,
Sorry about
definitely. So
that.
you
That's
know,
so rad.
I think I think that's the thing that maybe as Africans, African musicians in the future, we have to rethink collective. You know, we've been used for so many years to think individual. Even Afrobeats, you have only artists. You don't have an Afrobeats band, you know, and that's kind of
Mm.
strange. You know,
Wow, that
you
is
have hip hop
true.
artists. You have hip hop artists, you have hip hop crews, you have hip hop bands. You know, Outkast is a band,
Yep.
Snoop Dogg is an artist. You know, like Slum Village was a crew. You know, it's the same musical artistic expression, but with different flavors, different styles. You cannot name an Afrobeats band. You know, you
Wow.
have singers, female singers, and male singers, and that's a problem. You know, that's a problem because you have rock bands, rock singers, rock, you know, musicians, and it's how can it be a music style if you don't have instrumentalists that are known and reckoned? If you have bands that are known and reckoned, producers that are known and reckoned, sound engineers that are known and reckoned, you know, all of that creates musical arrangers or orchestrators that are also known and reckoned. All of that creates an artistic movement. You know, that's why I think that, you know, going back to the past and drawing inspiration back from the past is the first thing, and then in order to be, I would say, I wouldn't say competitive, but to be realistically, uh, I would say, relatable in the modern world, you also have to work with the elements that we have today, you know, which is social media and all that stuff. But we've, unfortunately, that's my observation, we've been focusing a bit too much on the image, you know, and the presentation in terms of modern African music in general, you know, not that much on the musicianship and going back to, hey, let's be a band in you know, in a venue or in a rehearsal room, the four of us, and even though we have electronic synthesizers playing, that's not the problem. We just play together, we practice together, and that's the thing I think that got lost with the TV show. You know, when I was a music director, I was really insisting on the band being a band, you know, and the band being a band apart from the production and apart from the artists. And as soon as I left, things went in a different way because, you know, as you know, if you want to get good musical results, you have to spend a lot of time and sacrifice a lot of time in order to make it happen, you know. And that's the thing. We are all, unfortunately, taking, you know, the short roads a bit too much, you know, in the way we conceive arts and artistic expression, which is one of the reasons why we are still trying to catch up, in my observation. Yeah.
Well, I love what I've heard from you, and it's a lot of stuff. That video of the oh, please forgive me,
Liomba?
Leomba Church.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of had this almost like it's its own thing, but you could hear not only the influences from like new wave or even like Andre 2000, but
Yeah.
like this kind of like it's its own thing. I can't even really describe it, but it's just really hip and it rocks out, but at the same time it has this backbeat that's just like so
Uh,
strong in that regard, you know. And
really,
are you
really,
guys
really glad. Really glad
with
that you
that?
mentioned, and really glad that you mentioned Andre 3000 because, you know, definitely the whole Hey Ya
Yeah,
or the
yeah,
stuff that we used to do on the Stankonia, the B.O.B., you know, those really hard beats, you know,
yeah.
Bombs Over Baghdad, you know, Hey Ya, you know, you had a lot of songs like that on the Love Below with that driving drum machine. Yeah, that's a direct influence from Outkast production, definitely. So I'm glad you mentioned this. Really,
It
definitely.
rocks out. That's the thing. Like it has that meeting between something like Outkast or Andre to it even kind of harkens back to the early 80s new
Yeah,
wave bands like even Two Boy Army. You know, even though like Gary Newman stuff is a little
yeah,
slow, but like it kind of still has like, you know, like imagine My Shadow in Vain kind of hyped
yeah,
up, you know, or like Cedric Sharpley, he's, you know, the drummer from Gary Newman's band. Like I could see him playing on that.
yeah,
And I have to
yeah.
ask you, did you use it? I noticed the DJ. So the DJ was on that too,
Yeah,
as well as
yeah,
like the other instruments. That's really cool,
yeah,
man. I was
yeah.
digging
Because
it.
he's a very good producer. He's one of the guys who I'm trying to work with him as much as possible when I travel to Nairobi. He's a great, great producer, you know, and also he's someone who very open-minded in terms of creativity, and he's a bit younger than me, but he also understands the whole concept of, just like you said, new wave and the use of synth and drum machines, and all can fuse live drums and drum machines and balance that out so that, you know, it gets something really special, you know, special flavor and texture to the drums and to the overall sound. So yeah, yeah, definitely we it's a good production team. The only thing is that, you know, that's something that is still working on, you know, having more and more and more possibilities to expand, you know, and create more and more stuff. I would like to actually to work more and have more time to develop some ideas and, you know, and push through. But yes, I think and also the fusion between electronic sounds and live sounds, for me, that's where African musicians could actually now start bringing something together that is going to be interesting. You know, if it's all electronic, I don't think we have the whole understanding and capacity to do that, you know, on a level that is really creative and really mind blowing. It's going to get there, but it's going to take a little bit of time. But if it's only with the acoustic instruments, then you also lose something to me, which is a bit more, a bit too much. You know, the Radio Masoda album is, I think it's great work, but it's like a traditional, you know, tribute kind of record to a certain era of African music. Now, if you think about the future or something, you know, how do we take it, you know, from there, from where we are now and where we're supposed to go? I think it should really be a fusion between modern electronic sounds and real playing, real singing, you know, and from
It
there,
sounds amazing. It sounds really good. I even had a little bit of hint of bands like Noi too.
yeah,
They're kind of a little, you know, it kind of had that vibe, but it's its own thing, and that's yeah, I could feel it. I could totally feel it, man. With that, I'm gonna say this. I'm gonna ask, what's up? There's Rhoda Dakar. We got Rhoda Dakar from the Body Snatchers. If you don't know who they are, they're like a legendary ska band that, you know, she was in and was the lead singer of it. And just, yeah, man, she's an icon herself, you know. And we've had a lot of cats come through. Bashong, is that my man Kimmit Pryor? Um, yeah, man. Shouts to all of you guys that have come through. One of my sounds came through, Long Beach County.
I think
Um, but
there's,
yeah,
yeah,
man,
that's,
Frank, this has been real cool, but I have to ask this also. What are you doing like now as a moment? Because I know you're busy. Like I know you just released a new album, but still, I'm sure you're working even right now. You know, like
yeah. Yeah, we are really, you know, the last two records that we worked on. The first one was a guitar album only. I really wanted to work really with the guitar, so that was the Moonwatching album that was released a year ago in December 2023, and there was some kind of a, I would say, tribute to Prince, quote unquote, record, because ever since he passed, you know, that was a real, you know, blow for me because he represented so much for us, you know. He represented so much for us, you know. And for me, he's probably, even though he's a force of nature, some kind of, he's on the level of Michael Jackson for me, you know, in terms of creativity and how he revolutionized the entire industry and how he was able to, you know, inspire and mobilize so many people around the world, you know, and even me, you know. And I was fortunate enough to see him perform 3 times live, you know. So that was also a big thing. And, you know, his music and all the music he created was really something that we gravitate to even on the level of, you know, being fanatics, you know, like literally Prince fanatics, knowing all the bootlegs, all the shows, all the concerts, all the after shows he was performing. We were on that level, you know, and we still are to a certain way. So when he passed, I was like, oh, Michael passed, and then Prince passed, and Whitney Houston passed, and then from them it's been like every year you have so many great musicians who unfortunately are. You know, Quincy Jones passed a few, you know, weeks ago. You know, like rest in peace to him.
rest in peace.
So that. Yeah, that record was something that I spent a lot of time on because I was like, I didn't want to use vocals because I know that in order to use vocals, you really have to have something meaningful to say. And also, again, we go back to cultural thing and cultural expression. In terms of African singing, it's not mostly about, for years and years and years, it's been about, yeah, we're singing in this or that language. And now it's about what are we singing about?
Mm.
What should we be singing about? And how can we express those things? So before getting on the vocal album, I really want to do the guitar album first and work on the guitar and really use the guitar as a lead voice in a certain way and only play melodies that would, work within the chord structure and use a lot of sounds and take away all the keyboards and synthesizers, but just work with the effects, with the pedals and just with the guitar.
Which
And then
reminds
after
me,
we
I love that Robert Fripp tribute. I'm a King Crimson fan myself. I had to say
oh,
that.
thanks.
That was awesome.
Yeah, I really love King Crimson. Really love King Crimson too. So yeah, so after the Radio Master album was more like a tribute album, as I was saying, and now the new record that we're working on, we are hoping to have it really ready for March or April 2025. Now it's the album where we really are working with the song structures and trying to fuse that African quote unquote melodic element with rock song structures, which is a different ball game and a difficult task because just like I was saying, I'm sometimes hesitant between the, the fusion, where it's leaning. In order to make it authentic, it really has to be different. I was checking a Lenny Kravitz interview recently, and he was talking about the fact that when he was at the early stages of his career, he was just mimicking other artists that he was inspired, and after a time, he basically got inspired to work in the direction where he actually became famous. The first albums that he did, where he really was fusing all these different styles, and that many people were saying that his music was too was resembling the music from the 1970s a bit too much, that his influences were a bit too obvious in the work. I think that's the process where we are right now because we're just trying to digest all these different influences that we have and create something really, really strong out of it and really different, or it really, I would say, the original parts, how can we make it original? That's the most difficult thing. How can we make it original? How can we make it original? That's the key, because African musicians in general, they think that because they are singing their language or melodies coming from their hometown, that's the originality is there. I don't think that is true. I think that's the root of where you come from. When you don't have a clearly strong established culture that you can identify immediately, there's always has to be some kind of a renewal in what you do in order to, first of all, keep yourself, in check, and also try to make the whole artistic thing progress, and I'm very critical of my own work, very, very critical, because I know how difficult it is to write music that makes sense and that stands the test of time. I know it's very, very, very difficult, and we are compared to other cultures that are so firmly rooted in who they are and where they are that it's yeah, that it's even more difficult for us to create something that really makes it clear and gives other people the ability to identify who we are and what we stand for, because that's what culture is supposed to be in terms of musical creativity. What you are, what you stand for, and that's the main question mark that is on African music as we are today. That's my observation.
Man, this has been such an informative interview, man. I really appreciate you doing that. I mean, like
Thank
doing
you so
this
much.
interview and like just I get giddy sometimes. So like if I'm a little too like sorry
No, no,
about
no, no,
that.
no.
But
No,
man,
absolutely.
I'm gonna we're gonna close, but I wanna
Yeah.
have you give your social media and also give us a word of wisdom, before we close, man. It's been an honor to have you,
Uh,
with the Black History of Rock and Roll and celebrating our Black History of Rock and Roll month.
yes, yes. I'm glad that, first of all, and again, thank you so much for inviting me, because it was very it was a true honor and a surprise, because I've been following your page for a few months and checking these different things that are happening, all the different posts that you have, and these different bands and artists that I've learned about by checking your page regularly and your posts. And for the social media, I think I would say the website www.frankbyong.net is the best place to go, because you have all the different links in there. Have you seen, as you probably have seen, I'm not so active on social media because I'm trying to only communicate when I have important things to talk about, all new projects that I managed to put together. Um, and for the word of wisdom, I would say that there's a generation of African musicians who I think, are very, very, very talented. And I'm getting to a place right now in my life, and I'm at a certain age where I think I have a certain knowledge and a certain understanding of things. And I think it's very important that people in Africa and artists in Africa spend time reflecting on themselves and
Mm.
reflecting on how they are viewed by people outside of the African continent. We've been fooled for so many decades, thinking that everything came from Africa and that all the creativity, artistic creativity that went through the years and through the centuries was just a logical progression in time and space of African cultures worldwide. That's how we were born and raised, and that's how the African scholars also, that's the truth that they put forth and talked about for so many years. And after decades, we now have a clearer vision and understanding, and we know that this is not how things went down, and that there are way more things on the African continent that we still need to learn about ourselves as Africans, before we can present ourselves to the world. What I'm really, really, really hoping for the years and times to come is that there will be more emphasis on African cultural enrichment. Before we get political strength and economic, I would say, renaissance in Africa, there has to be a cultural assertion of who we are, where we are right now, and what's our relationship to the other. I wouldn't say, I'm not in that, yeah, the other cultures around. No, no, no. The other Black cultures outside of Africa. These are the first people that we have to respond to and dialogue with. But in order to be able to dialogue with them, we have to be able to present something that is sustainable and that is worth it. And apart from ourselves and our creations, it's also a presentation of our traditional cultures that makes sense for other cultures, for other people from the other Black, I wouldn't say diasporas, but the Black nations, around the world. Because, it's like everybody's waiting on us. That's the impression
Mm.
that I have right now. Everybody's waiting on us to say something meaningful. Not because everybody has to come back and migrate back to Africa. No, because if we are to build something, even cultural bridges or cultural understanding or cultural knowledge, of who we are, because we know who the other cultures are. The other cultures don't really know who we are, because
Mm.
they haven't seen much from us, as a people or a continent or a nation or civilization that is able to tell something about who she is. Apart from what happened centuries and centuries and centuries and thousands of years ago. Yeah, we can talk about Egypt as much as we want, but these are 1,000 years ago. This is 2024, and tomorrow is 2025. So what does Africa has to say to the world, or can contribute to the world on a cultural level in 2025, and the years and decades to come? And that's really, I would say, part of what I'm trying to do is elevate things a little bit, as much as I can on my level, to present a vision and a picture, cultural, visions of African music that are a bit different and a bit more modern and also a bit more truthful and meaningful, with all modesty. That's what we're trying to do. But I think this has to come from somewhere there in East Africa, because again, it all starts with the melody, just like we were saying before. And if Africa has something to say, it has to be said with a unique voice, with a similar voice, so that when we speak as Africans, yeah, we might have our differences and beefs between Africans, but we have to be able to speak with one voice culturally if we want to be heard. If we're not able to do that, it's going to be very difficult. That's my point of view.
Man, well, dang, man, I'm like, thanks, Frank. Thanks a whole lot, man. We really appreciate you. I'm all tie-toned now, man. Like, I really appreciate you coming out, and man, thanks for making this time, especially in a different country. We had two people from a different country. Mildred was one of them last year, and our brother from Australia in the band Persecute was the other one. So it's cool. I didn't have that until we had you. And thanks for gracing us with your interview on the last day of our Black History of Rock and Roll Month, the second year we're celebrating it. Man, what's up with me? But man, we're gonna sign out, and I want to say thanks a million for interviewing with me, man. This is awesome. And
thank you so much for inviting me. And let's keep in touch by email and communicate and converse. We'd be glad to actually keep on exchanging with you and working with you on a certain level if it's possible. Yeah, definitely.
Most definitely. If you ever come to LA, let me know. I have to come out and see you, man.
Okay, man. Great. No problem. We'll keep in touch. We'll keep in touch. Thank you so much.
All right, Kat. Thank you so much. Kittens, Black History of Rock and Roll. Black History of Rock and Roll. Black History of Rock and Roll. Peace and blessings to you. Best in Meawa, Woman, Feskadus, Ahadu Amlak, Amin. God bless y'all. Black History of Rock and Roll. Thank you again, Frank BIYONG. Check out his social. I'm going to put it on there. Peace.
Thank you so much. Take care. See you. Bye-bye.
You